collaboration of many individuals and nonprofit and tribal organizations working together to conserve and restore North America's grasslands and to ensure the continued survival and health of its wildlife, wildlands, and human societies. Lindsay currently serves as our part-time coordinator. We do need to support her, not just because she's my daughter, but to help us keep coordinating this work and putting on webinars like this. Those funds come from our partner organizations and from individuals. I strongly encourage you to support our work. In your invitation, there was a donate button that will take you to the GPCN landing page, which is on Defenders of Wildlife's website, who's our fiscal sponsor. Thanks again. I'll turn it back to Lindsay to do the introductions.
All right. Thanks so much, Cliff. So yeah, I'll just turn it over to Jeremy Hogan. We're so pleased to have him here from the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Yeah, take it away. So this is Healthy Landscapes, Healthy Communities, the Significance and Status of Canada's Prairie Grasslands.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Lindsay and Cliff. And thanks everybody for joining me today. I will share my screen, get the slides going, and then we'll get rolling. Everybody's looking at a slide deck. Looks good.
Looks good.
All right. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Cliff, for the land acknowledgement. I am also joining from Treaty 7 territory in Mohkinstsis, Calgary, and I really appreciate you taking the time to reflect on where we are and where we need to be in our path of reconciliation. Today, I'm here to talk to you about grasslands, and I believe that there are people on this call. I believe everybody on this call probably knows more about many of the aspects of our Great Plains than I do. So I am going to acknowledge that I am not the expert here, but I am hoping that we can have a great conversation about some of the things that the Nature Conservancy of Canada is hoping to undertake in our Prairie Grassland Action Plan between now and 2030. So a little bit about me. As I mentioned, I'm based out of Calgary. I've always been, an outdoor adventurer. I lived on the coast for a while, and I'm a dive master. I am an avid bike rider, including through the mountain passes of Calgary, where we get some pretty gnarly avalanche paths at times. And these days, I have a bunch of young kids, so my hikes are a little slower and a little louder, and often with something screaming in my ear on my back as I'm walking. But I've always loved my backyard in Calgary, and to the west I have the Rockies, to the east I have this sprawling expanse of what was intact prairie grasslands and is less and less, unfortunately. Why am I talking to you today and how did I get here? Well, my background is a primatologist. So I worked in Northwest Costa Rica in a small park called Santa Rosa National Park and studied the ecology of white-faced capuchins, who are the monkeys in the middle bubble there. How they interacted with their plants and environment. And I was fortunate enough to overlap with the two wonderful people in the top right, and that is Dan Jansen and Willie Hallwachs. They're entomologists from the US, and they have been in Costa Rica since the 60s, studying the invertebrate populations of Santa Rosa National Park. And they realized very quickly, as their mist nets were returning fewer and fewer study species and study insects every year, that something was happening and something drastic was happening. And Dan likes to say, when your house is on fire, you don't need a thermometer, you need a fire hose. And he realized that studying these insects was great, but what good were those papers being published if there was, no insects left for that literature to matter? So he became a private action conservationist and started working with the Costa Rican government and private funders to start buying the land around Santa Rosa National Park. And now it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site known as the Área de Conservación Guanacaste, and it expands across from the Pacific to the Atlantic, all the way across northern Costa Rica, and provides contiguous intact movement for all of the animals that migrate from the lowlands of the Pacific up into the volcanoes and the cloud forests in the interior as the dry season and wet season takes hold. And it's just one of those wild conservation success stories that proves that we can do this. We just need to take action. And it's not too late. So with that, I was studying these wonderful primates, and the monkeys gave me all kinds of joy. But in my own backyard, there was a crisis brewing. So I put down my thermometer and I picked up my fire hose, and I came back home to deal with one of the most endangered ecosystems on the planet, in my own backyard, and that's the prairie grasslands. More and more every year, we're seeing contiguous losses. To give you a perspective of the scope and scale, it's over 80% of the grasslands of Canada have been lost, and there's places in the US that's similar. So Texas, for example, is a similar 80%. Across the whole Great Plains, which spans into northern Mexico, over close to 2/3 has disappeared. And it's not just an early colonialization and cultivation problem. It's still ongoing to this day. With all that land being lost, wildlife is going with it. So grassland songbirds have lost, it's been called a biological annihilation. So 800 million birds have disappeared off the Great Plains in the last 50 years. There's more species at risk in the grassland than any other ecosystem in Canada. And there are more and more joining them every year. So nothing on this page is extinct, but many of them, including the greater sage grouse, burrowing owls, swift fox, bison, have been essentially wiped off the prairies in Canada and in many places in the US as well. There were 300 million plains bison at the turn of the 20th century, 19th century. And today there's less than 100,000, and most of them are in commercial herds. They're essential for more than just wildlife and for ecosystems. They're culturally significant places. So grasslands have been stewarded by Indigenous people since time immemorial. Many of the grasslands, including just south of me in the Milk River Ridge, were unglaciated and provided habitat for wildlife species and humans during the last ice age in Canada. And they've been continuously settled by Indigenous people and stewarded by Indigenous people. So these are landscapes of disturbance, and they require constant grazing and constant fire to keep them open and thriving grasslands. And a lot of those services were provided by the Indigenous peoples before colonialization. They're also, as I mentioned, incredibly biodiverse places. You know, if you look at a couple square meters of a prairie grassland, you'll find more different species than you would find in a temperate forest. And that's because the microdiversity is just astounding in these places. They're culturally significant for, urban centers as well. So 800 million people around the world rely on temperate grasslands for their livelihood. To put it in perspective, 10% of the earth is making a living off of temperate grasslands. They're also culturally significant for places like here in Alberta. There's a strong ranching history, and they're an important piece of our culture in Alberta, and that's true elsewhere in the plains as well. So that provides a lot of food production. It's one of the only ecosystems where we can generate food production without negatively affecting the ecosystem, as long as it's done sustainably. So you can have an active cattle ranch and still have rich biodiversity. And then the ecosystem services, which we'll get into in a little bit, but that intact native ecosystems provide all kinds of knock-on benefits for humans in terms of water storage and filtration, carbon sequestration, soil storage, and aeration, and many other factors. So as I mentioned, there is this unique path where ranching and native ecosystems can coexist. Food production and native ecosystems can coexist, and ranching on temperate grasslands is one of those paths. So it turns out that as the grasslands are a landscape of disturbance, different rates of grazing will affect different patches of habitat and result in different, grass lengths and species compositions, and different wildlife species prefer different levels of grazing. So originally this was performed by bison in abundance, 300 million of them on the plains. They were essentially eradicated from this ecosystem, and that resulted in a lot of encroachment from the woody ecosystem surrounding. So Aspen Parkland to the north of me as a good example. And it turns out that cattle managed sustainably can provide a lot of the same grazing pressure that bison can. So it's not every ecosystem service that bison used to perform. So a great example is that bison will wallow, and they create these shallow depressions on the landscape because they're just such big, vigorous animals. When they're rubbing on the ground, these depressions form, and then the spring runoff, it actually captures a little shallow water pool. And those little shallow water pools are used for things like northern leopard frogs to breed. Cattle do not provide those, but they do provide different levels of grazing when they're managed and moved throughout the landscape by sustainable ranchers. And that provides different pockets of grass height and species that allow things like a Sprague's pipit to colonize or a Baird sparrow. And they do not do well in ungrazed grasslands. And that this was learned in places like Grasslands National Park, which actively excluded ranching and cattle grazing for its first 10 years of existence. There was some studies done that proved that the grasslands were healthier and more functional with a level of grazing introduced into the park. And now grazing is encouraged and part of the action plan for Grasslands National Park in Canada. So it's a recognized, proven tool for grassland sustainability. And this has all kinds of benefits for all of us. The temperate grasslands store more carbon in Canada than any other ecosystem. And that's mostly in the top 30 centimeters of soil in the organic biomass that gets captured by these really deep root networks that native grass species and forbs have. So they penetrate deeply into the soil and they pull carbon down with them. And then as the roots die off and the bacterial mats form, that carbon gets stored safely away under the top 30 to 60 centimeters of soil. That carbon is actually safer than somewhere like a temperate forest where a wildfire comes through and burns off all of the carbon in one big fire. When a grassland fire happens, that carbon stays safely underground. And a recent study by Driver et al. In 2021 suggests that avoided conversions of our grasslands is the single biggest nature-based solution that Canada has for mitigating the worst effects of climate change moving forward. And you can see on this little figure in the bottom of this slide that in general, reducing natural ecosystem conversion is the most effective nature-based solution that the world has, aside from renewable energy sources. And it costs us nothing to avoid this conversion moving forward. And it has other knock-on benefits, such as pollination services. So a preprint that some of the Nature Conservancy of Canada has worked on that's under peer review right now suggests that from native grasslands surrounding in cropland in the prairies of Canada, which is this map on the screen here, there are $2 billion worth of pollination services provided to those crops every year, and that's equivalent to feeding 25 million people from things like native bee species that live in the grasslands that are neighboring these crops. They also provide incredible benefit for water filtration and storage. We're about to go into a drought in much of Western Canada. There's evidence that intact grasslands provide as much as a 50% increase in recharge of our groundwater systems. So keeping these grasslands intact is worth billions of dollars annually to all of us. And it's not just the people that live and work in the grasslands, it affects the whole world. So there should be a priority on recognizing these values and prioritizing their protection. Unfortunately, that is not the case. So how did we get here? A big factor is that protection. So in Canada, less than 60% of native grasslands is currently protected. And it's one of the few ecosystems that saw a decrease in the most recent estimates. So between 2010 and 2015, the protection rate actually declined in Canada because Crown land was sold for private use and then ultimately converted. And that's the biggest driver of grassland losses in the Great Plains is conversion for human uses. It's cropping, it's urban expansion, but there's also these other factors such as fragmentation and linear disturbances, such as the fence you can see here, which prevents pronghorn from completing their migration routes, or can actually trap them as the snow builds. They can't get under the fence and they don't jump, so they get trapped or they get stressed from trying to patrol up and down the fence line looking for an easier place to cross. Degradation from overuse. So I mentioned that sustainable grazing is compatible with biodiversity. Unsustainable grazing is not. And there are often times where land use is to the detriment of the native grasslands in place. Climate change is just exacerbating all of these effects. Hotter and drier is a kind of description that I think sums up what's happening in the Great Plains. And just the ongoing rate of loss is something else I want to highlight here. Since 2012, 32 million acres have been plowed under. In Canada, we estimate it's about 150,000 acres a year, continues to be lost. So this isn't just a problem that happened 100 years ago. It's ongoing and it's severe. And what's driving this is cost. So current economics favor, so land value is based on highest and best use. And in the United States, and it's the same in Canada, cultivated land value is triple the value of native intact grassland in the Great Plains. So you get more money by breaking up your land and selling it than you do by keeping that native grassland intact. You then additionally have more economic value from crop production versus beef production. So in a vacuum, taking land value out of it, with very few exceptions, production of crops on cultivated land is more profitable for a agriculturalist than animal production on that same acre. And that leads to cultivation. There's just this economic pressure for people to break their land and plant crop. The second big threat that's coming up on us is demographics. So agriculture, more so than any other industry, is increasingly aging. And the average ranch owner in North America is in their 60s. Over 60% are over 70 years old. And there isn't a clear path forward for succession. Because of these land value disparities and the increase of land costs over time, it's too expensive for producers to buy land when it comes for sale, and they can't compete with crop production. So these ranchers are left with a tough choice of, do I sell my land and provide a succession plan for my kids in the form of money, or do I hand them over the land and they do the same thing? There just isn't that interest in continuing a sustainable ranching operation. And there's evidence out of a lab in Canada from Waterloo University that suggests close to 50% of land that's sold in Prairie, Canada is converted after sale. So this is by far the riskiest time for conversion is during the sale price. So this is a place of intervention need. And then the final piece is bad marketing. So grasslands are not well known outside of, maybe the people in this room and a few other select supporters. A recent study done by the Canadian Wildlife Foundation and the Weston Family Foundation suggests that fewer than 20% of Canadians feel comfortable defining a grassland, or would say, yes, they know what a native grassland is and what it looks like. And those same people, the same percentage, are the only ones that realize how threatened and how severe the threat is to these grasslands. But when you talk to these people a little further and share with them what grasslands are, all the important benefits they provide, and how at risk they are, they identify grasslands as one of the most important places to deploy conservation action. So it's just a matter of getting grasslands known in the general market and making sure that people in urban centers know how important grasslands are for their health and well-being as well. And then the other side of this marketing issue is there has been historical friction between agricultural producers and environmental organizations and conservation organizations. And I think it's fair. There's been, there's been conflict at times, and I think there's need to recognize that there are best practices that can be shared and learned, and we can be stronger together and working together for a sustainable path forward for both biodiversity and food production. So what do we do about it? I would say the first thing is change that conversation. So working together between agricultural producers and environmental groups, and then making sure that all North Americans and all the world knows about the importance of our temperate grasslands, all of the ecosystem services they provide, all the biodiversity it protects, and how threatened it is and how quickly it's disappearing right in front of our face. We can also support good stewardship in all its forms. So as I mentioned before, Indigenous peoples have been stewarding grasslands for millennia, since time immemorial. And there is this really important opportunity to facilitate reconnection to the land. So through Indigenous protected and conserved areas, through Indigenous stewardship practices, there's some great examples of some land sharing networks where facilitated visitation in a safe and welcoming space is provided. All of these different avenues for reconnection and for learning Indigenous ways of knowing and how historical stewardship took place, the use of fire, the use of bison migration patterns. All of these things are great ways that we can learn moving forward and provide that stewardship that grasslands need. The deployment of best management practices. So this is you know, as I mentioned, there's grazing patterns that benefit biodiversity, and there's grazing patterns that can negatively affect biodiversity. And having an idea of the health of your grasslands and the health of the stocking rates that are and the grazing patterns that can be used to improve the health of those grasslands, those result in best management practices, BMPs, that often will provide stewardship recommendations. So things like offsite watering systems or the use of razor grazer electrical fences. And that improves the range and riparian health for the native ecosystems that are used for cattle production. But a lot of times those mechanisms and those implementation plans cost money. And those are not the highest priority thing for a cattle producer. So there are opportunities, such as the Western Family Foundation Prairie Grassland Initiative, to provide financial and technical support to implement these stewardship plans and bring a more sustainable grazing pattern into play. The bottom right corner is Nature Conservancy in Canada, Alberta's agrologist at a range stewardship day for youth, showing them the different species of grass on that native habitat and the different ways of grazing, and just having those kind of conservation minded practices thought about and talked about and shared is one of the best paths forward we have. Peer-to-peer networking groups are in play in places like WWF US has their Sustainable Ranching Initiative, and they bring together ranching partners to talk about best practices and talk about the importance of conservation and the benefit of conservation for your business. So one of the things I didn't mention, I should have a couple slides ago, is that native grassland species are often more nutritious forage, and you don't have to provide input costs by supplementing feed. So keeping your grassland healthy is good for business. The other thing we can do is improve the economics. So identifying those externalities of ecosystem services that aren't captured at the time of conversion, and then providing some form of payment for them, whether that's a voluntary or a mandatory market, what form those markets take. So one of the early examples is voluntary carbon markets. There is an avoided conversion of grassland market in Canada now, and we expect the first projects to be registered this year. There are other programs in the US as well, but there's other forms as well. So there's biodiversity credits that can be considered. There's natural infrastructure systems at play where insurance companies are now paying for you to keep a wetland intact near a major urban center because it reduces the risk of insurance payout downstream during a major flood and things like that. And the climate change related disaster payouts in North America have exponentially increased, and insurance companies more and more are valuing these natural infrastructure systems that help mitigate their claim expenses. What we all do need to agree on is how to value these ecosystems and who should pay for it, and then also what framework and rigorous standards are in place to make sure that the market is comfortable paying for these services. As I mentioned, succession and the loss of a emerging young producer cohort is a major concern, and that's because of the extremely high price of land and the low opportunity to buy into the industry. And it's just not a competitive industry to participate in if you have alternatives such as crop production. So there's opportunities for providing low interest loans to get people in the door, or using tools such as conservation easements or agreements, depending where you live, to reduce the value of land by stripping off the environmental value of it first, and then entering it into the market at a reduced rate. There's some cooperative models that are great examples. So the Waldron Ranch in southwest Alberta is a grazing co-op where there's 60 shareholders that each own shares, and each share is worth a certain amount of grazing rights for your cattle every year. And the stocking rates are set by a paid for stewardship manager and a ranch manager. Everybody is in it for the long term. And the Nature Conservancy of Canada has a conservation agreement in place to keep that land intact for perpetuity. The final piece is something that NCC is not involved in, but I think is important to mention, is that there's opportunity for policy reform. So there's many perverse incentives at play in the agricultural market. So in the US, for example, the clean fuel standard resulted in a significant increase in grassland conversion immediately surrounding ethanol refineries, because those grasslands were converted for corn production to be used to meet the clean fuel standard. So trying to meet climate-related targets resulted in more natural ecosystem degradation and probably worse carbon outcomes because of the loss of those grasslands. So this is an example of a perverse incentive from a well-meaning policy. Another example would be the use of crop insurance subsidies. So many different states and different provinces will subsidize insurance for agricultural producers for their croplands. And it turns out that in the US, states that have a higher level of subsidy for crop production see more marginal lands converted because private crop producers are more willing to take risk on that land, knowing that if it fails, they're backstopped by this cheaper insurance payout. And that resulted in an accelerated rate of grassland conversion in those states versus states that had a lower subsidy. Canada has very similar paths moving forward. We have a clean fuel standard, we have crop insurance subsidies. There isn't a similar subsidy in place, or there aren't as easily accessible and useful tools in place for cattle production, as an example. Another example would be the North American Grassland Conservation Act, which was introduced to Congress in 2022. I do not follow American politics, so I will say that I don't understand the full nuance and complexity of that system, but it is essentially stalled, and I don't believe there's been any progress made since that introduction. And something like that moving forward, it's modeled after the North American Wetland Conservation Act, and waterfowl and wetland birds have exploded successfully in their numbers because of action taken to prevent further wetland loss and conversion and protecting those waterfowl populations in numerous ways. So there is a model for doing this in the grasslands. I see a hand up. I'm happy to stop and take questions, or we can wait to the end. I don't know. Lindsay, do you have a preference?
Wait
to the end. Wait to the end.
I see you, Shami.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So what are we going to do about it? I hope I've painted a picture of the need for conservation action in all its forms. Now let me talk to you a little bit about what the Nature Conservancy of Canada hopes to do. I am the director of Prairie Grassland Conservation for NCC. We are a private charity based in Canada. We've been around for about 60 years. And to date, between partner projects and our own projects, we've conserved 15 million hectares, coast to coast to coast, as we like to say. And you can see much of that protected area network is in the southern settled area of Canada, where risk is the highest and conversion rates are at their most extreme. We use a whole lot of different tools to get conservation complete. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, but we are looking for durable outcomes and the assurance that those ecosystems will remain intact and thriving for generations and in perpetuity in most cases. We have a planning and prioritization system in place because, unfortunately, we do not have endless funds and we have to pick and choose what we're most interested in moving forward with. So we use the CARE principles, which is connected, adequate, representative, and effective. And we have landscape level planning tools that go in place and identify which areas are the most important in terms of biodiversity and the most threatened in terms of predicted likelihood of loss without intervention. And those are the areas we prioritize. And you won't be shocked to know that the prairie grasslands of Canada are one of those extremely high important sites for us. Just because we conserve something, we also don't, it doesn't just stop there. So especially because so many of our intact ecosystems are fragmented or separated from each other, there needs to be action in place, a property management plan in place to ensure that the landscape remains functional and thriving. So things like avoiding invasive species concerns or alternative land use practices that are detrimental to the health of the ecosystem. But again, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think this infographic illustrates it beautifully, where different tools in different places are the most effective strategy. And more, we're realizing that what we do, what NCC does, I believe in. As I told you, I came from an example of land-based conservation being effective in Northwest Costa Rica, and that's what led me to come back to NCC. But we can't do it at the scale needed at the rate of ecosystem loss in North America. So we're looking for ways for partnership and to facilitate conservation with other organizations. So we do things like we will support good stewardship practices on community pastures in Saskatchewan, and we will use our agrology team to make recommendations for best management and things like that. Or we will support other conservation groups and other land trusts to help fundraise and to help communicate and all these important things. To date, in the Prairies specifically, we have about 500,000 acres under NCC stewardship, but then another 1 million acres on supported lands. And that includes community pastures across all 3 provinces and facilitated conservation projects. And that leads us to the Prairie Grassland Action Plan. So we need to do more and we need to go faster. So historically, we are only conserving about 20% of what is lost every year. So we need to get up to closer to 500,000 hectares, 1.2 million acres by 2030 to just offset the rate of ongoing loss. So that's the goal of the action plan, is to have no net new loss in Canada by 2030. We estimate that's going to cost about $500 million to complete. And to do that, we have 4 strategies. I'll share the action plan after this, and I'm happy to chat more. I think we'll have lots of time for questions. But we're supporting public land conservation, including those community pastures. There's some major grasslands on federal lands, such as Shiloh Air Force Base was one of the first other effective conservation measure conserved lands in Canada. There's opportunity for different designations of land uses in all 3 provinces. Supporting Indigenous-led conservation. So this is providing better access and opportunity for Indigenous-led stewardship, for land transfer through Indigenous protected and conserved areas, from learning from Indigenous practices to improve our stewardship of these grasslands. Accelerating private conservation. So this is NCC's bread and butter. We've done this for 60 years in Canada. We have a few different tools we use, but again, we need to do more of it. And to do more of it, we need more people interested in participating in private land conservation. So we need to grow our community within this ranching community, which 75% of Canada's grasslands are owned privately, and the majority of that 75% are working ranches. So this is where we need buy-in and we need engagement, and we need things that make conservation attractive for these people. So things like those emerging markets for payment for ecosystem services, or finding tools to reduce the cost of land purchase to allow for sustainably minded ranchers to continue and expand their operations. And then again, it doesn't stop at securement. So stewardship and restoration are important. Even if we were just to try and avoid no net loss, to commit towards Canada's 30 by 30 targets, restoration is necessary because less than 20% of the grasslands are left. So to connect key contiguous pieces through selective restoration is going to be important moving forward. And to do that, we need to build the capacity of restoration in Canada. So one of the bottlenecks right now is there isn't enough native seed stock available to commit to the restoration needed. So supporting those industries and supporting those seed growers, supporting restoration specialists is another component of the action plan. I mean, this kind of sums it all up, but this is a partnership endeavor. So NCC can't do this alone, and we're looking for all the help we can get and all the opportunities available to us to facilitate accelerated conservation with all interested parties. So if you are one of those interested parties, please talk to me. So we launched in this time last year, 2023, I'm losing track of time. And to date, we've conserved about 100,000 acres, including Canada's largest private conservation agreement in history, which is McIntyre Ranch here in southern Alberta. Through initiatives like the Weston Family Prairie Grassland Initiative, we have stewarded an additional 200,000 acres, as well as worked with the Working Landscapes team and community pastures in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. We've restored about 2,000 acres, including prescribed fire and reseeding of select properties. And we've raised about $100 million to do this work. So we are making great progress, but we still need to do more and we still need to accelerate. We have some really exciting Indigenous-led conservation projects in each province, and they're, we need to have a broader strategy and a more engaged landscape plan in place moving forward. And we are working with various government officials to have public lands be considered conserved and within the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas database. So that can be protected areas, but can also be these other effective measures that I talked about before. So in conclusion, this is a big task, but I hope that we all agree that it's not insurmountable. We just need to take collective and collaborative action. I'm really excited for this opportunity to talk to you all today, and I hope that I can hear some great ideas about how we can best move forward together. I'm going to leave some links so you can contact me or you can learn more about the action plan, and I am happy to take questions. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Great, thank you so much, Jeremy. That was wonderful. Yeah, Shani had a question, so you can start there. And then if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the chat. After Shani, there's a couple of questions in the chat that we can go to, Jeremy, if that works for you.
Sounds great. Shammy, I think you're muted.
Hey, Jeremy, great presentation, so thoughtful. Thank you so much for presenting. Wow, there's a lot there. And hats off to NCC for all the work you all are doing for grasslands up north. I'm actually in Bozeman about to go into a grassland bison meeting. I chair the GPCM Bison Working Group. I'm also on the Continental Strategy Steering Committee, and Defenders of Wildlife is who I work for, senior representative. We do a lot with the park. We help move Yellowstone bison to the tribes and hopefully soon to Canada by way of Fort Peck. Maybe it's going to be about a year, but we're making those discussions relevant. You know, your conversation about private. So here's the thing with the Continental Strategy, we have the North American Bison Society. We have like agricultural interests as well as cultural herds, wildlife managed herds, all included, all hooves on the ground, indigenous led, as part of that as well. And in America, we have about 500,000 bison, the majority of which are managed as agriculture. There's about 40,000 in cultural herds, about another 40,000 in Department of Interior herds managed as wildlife. So the thing that comes to be a challenge for us in the conservation community is recognizing that it's all hooves on the ground is an opportunity, but making sure that we can have conservation and cultural herds of 1,000 animals or more ecologically and culturally doing their part. So it's a little bit of a different animal that we're advocating for, in terms of like management. And the challenge has been, like, for example, with climate change, as you so articulated so well, is we're not, even though this is it is a keystone species, we're not seeing this animal. We're having challenges with drought, right? And so we're not seeing the forage availability like we had in the historic past, where we know bison were a consequence to that, and they still are, obviously, but even just keeping animals healthy at this point, supplemental feed is required. And so my question to you is, has Nature Conservation Canada considered this dichotomy of making sure we have agricultural animals available, and also contributing, but really, I think the focus of the groups I'm affiliated with are really about the wildlife ones, because they are a different animal. They graze in a mosaic pattern, how they breed and all this, they don't have that cattle integration. They are wild. But at the same time, there's some husbandry involved, disease testing, and also just making sure we have enough available forage. So I'm just curious about, this is a big question, and I'm sure you can't answer it right now, but it'd be great to engage with you about this, because this is the big grapple of all of our work, indigenous, federal lands, the like. But I just sort of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for that, Jamie. It is a very complicated question, and it's one that NCC is actively looking into. So, for context, we do have our own established bison herd on a property in Saskatchewan called Old Man on His Back, and that herd has been successful to the point where we have now been able to translocate, rematriate buffalo to local Indigenous nations to start their own herds. We provide the, I guess, the technical consultation with regards to keeping that herd healthy and making sure the intact landscape is there for them, because it's a different landscape now than it was 150 years ago when bison were wiped off the map. And there's a great little article that a NCC supporter named Lauren Fitch wrote it's called Bison is the Answer, What is the Question? And he talks about there's a need to understand that not all current situations will bison be compatible with that landscape. And they're only sustainable if they have large areas to roam and migrate, they have access to water. So we're figuring this out internally. And we're also making sure that we're being mindful of, we have important and well-established relationships with agricultural producers in many landscapes. And we have an obligation to work with them and make sure that we're not walking offside from them as well. So we're being very careful about our approach to bison, but we are also supporting nation efforts because they're sovereign nations, and they understand what's best for them and their lands, and we're there to support them as supportive environmental partners. So a good example is the Métis Nation of Alberta has both commercial and cultural herds, and manage them both differently and for different outcomes, but with restoration in mind on native grasslands and with stewardship of their lands in mind, as well as cultural importance and economic importance. So I think that's a really great model that I'm looking forward to learning more about as they launch those efforts in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Jeremy. And let's definitely connect offline. Appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, so Steve had a question in the chat. There are many suggestions here. Some will take longer, obviously, policy reform. Do you have a timeline view of what we can achieve by when? And then in brackets, I'm an optimist, so I like to think that a lot can be done quickly, but realize pragmatism must enter the equation.
Yeah, thanks. I am also an optimist, so maybe we're gonna just rile each other up and get too excited, but like the fact that the avoided conversion of grasslands market is coming into play. We've seen signs from the government of Canada that they are very interested in accelerating grassland conservation. And right now, to be totally, I guess, frank and candid, the biggest limitation to NCC's work is financial. We just don't have enough money to do the projects that we have available to us right now. So we need to find ways to get large transformative gifts into the grassland conservation space. And I think there are opportunities out there in the US. There's large landowners, billionaires like the Ted Turners of the world. Jeff Bezos has jumped in with his Pasture Watch program. So I think these are the kind of, like, we need to be thinking about $100 million transformational funding to get things to where they need to be. But I'm also encouraged by groups like the joint venture of the Prairie. So I work under the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture under the North American Wetland Conservation Act. And the different joint ventures are combined, called the JV8. And they are about to release a business case for grassland conservation. And it has really ambitious goals, from what I understand, like billions of dollars of funding behind it. So, and that would be a collaborative effort between governments of all three nations, as well as private fundraising and all that kind of stuff. So I see signs on the horizon that we're about to turn a corner, but we still have to get that buy-in from the market, and the market is the public. If they make grasslands important, then it becomes important for politicians and for foundations and things like that.
Great. We've got Cliff, and then we'll do Rurik after.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yep, you covered all the waterfront and a bit more.
Coast to coast to coast.
But I think that optimism is deserved, and I thought it might be good for us to actually to show how grasslands have accelerated in importance on the policy side, on the financing. It's still not enough, but from where we were 30 years ago, I mean, it's light years ahead, and I like to say it's about planets coming into alignment. So is there still a focus? I don't know how much you deal with the National Office and the Green Budget Coalition and what they're asking for, but is that, a big piece of, this priority places and funding for that the federal government has?
Yes, I am not part of the Green Budget Coalition conversations, but I can tell you that NCC is part of those conversations, and that grasslands is important both to NCC and the other partners in the coalition. And it's there are large planned asks, both from ECCC and AAFC in the next couple of years.
Thanks.
Jeremy, thank you very much. Very interesting. It's scary to see that grassland is being lost at a faster pace than in Mexico, because in Mexico it's vanishing very, very quickly. I'm in Central Mexico. We no longer have bison. We lost them in the Pleistocene in Central Mexico, but working with the continental efforts. And my comments is from this perspective. First of all, I must say that any gain is better than any loss. And sustainable cattle management is certainly better than bad cattle management. And I know that it can maintain soil, increase biodiversity. And as you pointed out, bison and cattle are not the same. They perform similar, but not all the same ecological functions. But often, the people seem to think that with cattle they can replicate bison, and therefore that bison are no longer necessary because cattle is doing their job. And grasslands grasslands grow where it doesn't rain too much as to be forest and too much to be deserts. But also is an ecosystem maintained by biotic interactions. So once you disturb a grassland, at least for the south, I'm not familiar with the Canadian grasslands, the alternative stable state is different from a grassland because of the lack of these species that perform ecological functions. A very important one that is a problem with cattle is predation. Where there's cattle, there tends to be predator control. And with bison, there isn't. So I just like to see, and you mentioned some of it on the answers previously, but I think we need to start trying to increase the number of bison, replacing cattle, but also we need to change, and it is very difficult, the way we have been doing cattle ranching and remove fences so they can move in larger areas, but this needs some economic, the development of an economic model that will allow owners of a vast area to share the financial benefits of bison profits on an equitable manner. But we need to start thinking out of the box because the grassland are going to be maintained functionally with the native species, and given climate change, we need to do that very, very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, those are all super important points, and I agree with you that you cannot replace bison with cattle. I think that they are in the current context and the current landscape. I think there are different appropriate places for both. And I agree with you that there should be more opportunities for bison moving forward. And that will require things like figuring out how to get rid of a lot of fencing and how to open up large landscapes and how to share those economic models. I don't know enough about it, but my understanding is that the American Prairie Reserve is an example of that in the US, where they've reintroduced bison, and the herd is now successfully established to the point where they're allowing some selective sport hunting, for example, to manage the herd, and the economic benefits of that herd are being introduced to the local community who were cattle ranchers, and now we're seeing the benefit of bison back on the landscape. Because there's also fair and solvable challenges with the interface between bison and cattle, and worries about disease transmission and all those kind of things that should be thought through and made sure that everybody feels good moving forward, and we're not hurting anybody by jumping too quickly into things. I will give a quick plug to, this is a book called The Ecological Buffalo, and it's written by a guy named Wes Olson. He goes deep into all the various ecological benefits of bison and things like dung beetle diversity in the plains and how we've lost that, and the wallows, or lots of different things that have been lost, and an ecosystem function that has been lost because of the loss of bison. So.
And I'll just put a plug in. If you go to the GPCN website, we have a webinar with Wes that you can
go.
find there on his book. Tony, did you have your hand up there?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I was just wanting to address the issue of reintroduction of buffalo on public lands, which is potentially presents a lot of political challenges in Alberta. One of the first steps that probably needs to occur, and I believe that many people are working on this, is the redesignation of buffalo as wildlife. Because currently it's bison in Alberta are only designated under agricultural management practices. And in order to establish feasible wild herds in selected public lands, which as I hope the future unfolds that way, in a proper managed and balanced way, there's the issue of compensation for existing leaseholders. The foothills of Alberta are primarily used by ranching communities during the summer to graze cattle. And if we are going to move forward to introduce bison into public lands, in particular in the foothills, and there's a massive archaeological evidence, including friends and I have found buffalo skulls in foothill areas, ancient buffalo skulls. The problem of compensation for ranchers and negotiating with ranchers is going to be a vital part of that process. And I was curious about your experience with negotiations with ranching community, and also, and there are some very good examples in the United States. Anyway, that's sort of one of the concerns I wanted to raise.
Thanks for that. Yeah. So I mean, we're still just figuring ourselves out in this space and where we are on the bison front. The Old Man on His Back is a good example of that. That herd was introduced to Old Man on His Back about 25 years ago, and it led to a lot of uproar in the community. I would say through time and through community building, that is now a cherished part of Southwest Saskatchewan. And it took time and it took some engagement, but there is buy-in. And I'm hopeful that that will replicate itself elsewhere in the prairies. I think it needs to be done at the right place at the right time. As you mentioned, Alberta is challenging right now. I know AWA is thinking about those spaces, Alberta Wilderness Association. There's also there was an introduction on the U.S. side of the border that's considered a transboundary herd by the Blackfeet Nation. And currently they are not allowed into Canada, but that might change depending on what the government of Canada decides and Parks Canada decides, because Waterton Parkfront is right there. So this conversation is coming, and it's coming in the next couple of years. So we need to start having it and being open and collaborative about it. And I will say that in those ranching communities, it's not everybody is against bison all the time, and it's not everybody is either dead for it or dead against it. And there is room to build community and consensus. You just need to find your champions, and you need to work out people's fears, because a lot of times they're fears that are fair, but you can mitigate. So removing those barriers is the first step.
There are a couple questions about some of the studies in the chat. Could you please repeat the name of the study that surveyed Canadian public understanding of prairie and grassland?
Yeah, so that one is done by the Canadian Wildlife Federation with funding from the Weston Family Foundation, but I don't believe they've published it. There's a webinar. I'll see if it's in my calendar, and I'm not sure if it's a private webinar or not. I'll look into it, but they were planning on releasing a common language summary in the next month. And I'll try and find that, and I'll share it with Lindsay, if nothing else.
Great, yeah, and I'll make sure to include that in the newsletter. So if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll get it. And then similarly, I'd be interested in the study out of Waterloo, which reported 50% of land sold is converted after sale.
Yeah, and that one is also in prep. It's from I can't remember the name of his lab, but it's Jeremy Pittman was working on that data out of Waterloo University, and he was hoping to publish this summer. So again, another one that's too early to share.
Okay. All right, Cliff.
Yeah, so again, thanks for the hopeful thing on bison and ranchers and keeping everybody as conservation partners in this. We need everybody working on this and this subject. So I think just a note that on the public survey part of it, John Wilmshurst from Central Grasslands Roadmap Canadian Working Group and others is doing a presentation, I think next week or thereabouts, on that one of their surveys about the public understanding of grasslands and what we know and what the support is out there. So that might marry up nicely with what's already been published. And then we're also looking to Canada's Wild Buffalo Summit in the fall, late fall, where some of these issues, where we get ranchers, Indigenous peoples, NGOs, and government people all in the same room talking about how and where we can put wild buffalo back into the landscape. I use the term buffalo because one of my Indigenous friends, he says he prefers that term. As a scientist, I use bison. I think they're interchangeable, whatever we use. Thanks, Jeremy, for all your work on that. And I don't know if there are any other questions, but I found that session very good today and hopeful, which is what energizes me and helps me get back to work doing this great conservation work. So thanks again, Jeremy.
Thank you very much for the time. I really do appreciate, being here today with all of you. And I look forward to all the great work we're going to do together over the next few years.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy. We're so glad that you could join us today. And thanks for everybody who came out, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.